There are treasures still undiscovered to this day far beyond your wildest dreams. Gold caches so vast they would fill vaults and so valuable their discoverer would become one of the world's richest people in the world overnight. But what unsolved clues or missing pieces allow them to remain a mystery? Many have tried and perished in search of these unimaginable hoards of wealth. Will you be the one who solves their mysteries, or will they lay hidden for the rest of time? Number 14. The Lost Treasure of the Flor de la Mar. Somewhere at the bottom of the ocean lies a sunken 16th century Portuguese ship that is literally worth dying for. Maybe not literally, but this ship is said to have carried a treasure worth $2.5 billion on the day it sank. And of course, the sad end of the ship, known as Flor de la Mar, marks the beginning of an unending search. Flor de la Mar, meaning flower of the sea in English, participated in several colonial campaigns over the course of her 9 years of service in the Portuguese fleet. The ship was said to have been laden with spoils of war from the royal palace of the Sultan of Malacca before it vanished on its way to Portugal. While those alive at the time wondered what had happened to the ship, some of the theories pointed to the fact that the ship had undergone several major repairs before her final journey. Before the departure, the crew was reluctant to set sail, especially with the heavy payload from Malacca. Nevertheless, they did so in November 1511, bound for Portugal. On her way back, Flor de la Mar got caught in a storm so severe that she crashed into shoals, split in two, and sank on the night of November 20th, 1511. Unfortunately, about 400 men lost their lives, but a few others made it out alive, without the treasure. Since then, the treasure has never been found. However, in years that followed up until today, many explorers have set sail for the find, but none of them came back with the treasure, and today, the search for the lost ship, the Flower of the Sea, continues. Number 13. The Oak Island Treasure. If you haven't heard about Oak Island, you must be living under the rocks. As you must have guessed, the island didn't become this famous for any other reason other than a hidden treasure. For centuries, there have been searches for clues and answers on this island, but the treasure has remained elusive. Cursed? Maybe enough to inspire the reality show, The Curse of Oak Island, which garners millions of views per its episodes. But before it ever got to the TVs, the story started as far back as 1795. That year, a man named Daniel McInnes found an odd, shallow dip in the ground on Oak Island. He became curious about it, so he and two friends decided to dig into the spot to see what they could find. To their surprise, around 10 feet down, they came across a layer of oak logs, and as they kept digging, the three kept finding layers of logs every 10 feet. Even more interesting, they came upon a large rock covered in strange markings that none of them could read. Supposedly, an expert later determined the rock read, 40 feet below 2 million pounds are buried. That was the start of the never-ending search for the Oak Island treasure, inviting a line of treasure hunters, including Rick and Marty Lagina, who have collectively spent over 220 years trying to unearth the told riches. Theories abound as to who may have stashed a bounty there, from infamous pirates Captain Kidd and Blackbeard to secret societies like the Freemasons and Knights Templar. But the theories are not as disturbing as the lores surrounding this island, which have narrated tales of hauntings and eerie lights, including a widespread prediction that no treasure will be found until 7 treasure seekers have died trying to find it. Well, as at the time this video was made, the toll stands at 6. Even at that, people have not stopped digging up this island, and that's all thanks to the story that says Daniel McInnes and his friends, who later bought the land, suddenly became rich in the 19th century. For this reason, treasure hunters went from using shovels and picks in the 18th century to steam pumps and drill bits in the 19th century to open pit mining and bulldozers in the 20th century to the high-tech tools employed today. But despite the advances in technology, flooding and cave-ins have caused hunter after hunter to give up the quest. Not the Lagina brothers, though. It seems they never will. Number 12. Lost Dutchman Mine. One of the biggest unsolved West mysteries is the Lost Dutchman Mine, which has taken a lot of lives. Since the arrival of Spanish conquistadores, seekers of the mine have braved the Arizona desert in pursuit of a vein of pure gold, said to be somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. The result? Death of countless people who were either murdered or died naturally in their lust for these riches. For over 120 years, the legend of the Lost Dutchman Mine has been told repeatedly, growing in proportions to such an extent that some claim the entire legend is nothing but a myth. But for thousands of others, the mine and its legends are extremely real. The Superstition Mountain Range is located east of Phoenix, Arizona, more commonly referred to by locals as the Superstitions. This mountain is 3,000 feet high, and it stands majestically at the forefront of this rough terrain like it's standing guard over the rest of its territory. But what exactly is the story of this region? When the Spaniards arrived in 1540, the region was inhabited by the Apache Indians, who considered Superstition Mountain sacred ground as it was home to their thunder god. Led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, the conquistadors cared little about the Apache customs or beliefs, wanting only to find the legendary 7 golden cities of Cibola. Once the Spaniards made their intentions known, the Apache frowned against it and refused to help them, telling them that if they dared to trespass on the sacred ground, the thunder god would take revenge upon them, causing tremendous suffering and horrible deaths. Driven by greed, the Spaniards began to explore anyway, and almost immediately, men began to mysteriously vanish, to the point that warnings were given to never stray more than a few feet away from the rest of the group. Still, more men disappeared only to be found dead later, their bodies mutilated and their heads cut off. In fear, the conquistadors finally fled, refusing to return to the mountain, which they dubbed Monte Superstition. Just like that, the legend began. Fast forward to 1748, the Superstitions, together with some 3,750 square miles of what is now Arizona, were given to Mexican cattle baron Don Miguel Peralta of Sonora in a land grant. For the next century, the Peralta family and their laborers would make infrequent forays into Arizona, bringing out loads of ore that infuriated the Apaches. In order not to incur the wrath of the Apaches, they kept these mining trips at a minimum. However, in 1846, descendants of the original grant risked the wrath of the Apache and went back into Arizona. They did get gold, but they never made it back home as they were attacked by the Apache, spilling the gold everywhere. For years afterward, prospectors flocked to the area not only in search of the mine, but also in search of Mexican gold spilled during the massacre. To further heighten the hopes of seekers, the story says in the 1850s, 2 prospectors came upon 3 dead burros with intact pack saddles that contained some $37,000 worth of gold. There are dozens of variations of the lost mine tale, and almost as many reports of people having found the mine, leading to it being the most found and lost mine ever. However, these many variations and tales only add to the intrigue of the Lost Dutchman, enticing hundreds of treasure-hunting hobbyists and seasoned prospectors to continue searching for the elusive gold. Now, the Superstitions belong to the government, which means anything found here would have to be surrendered to the government. This, however, does not stop many seekers from going gold hunting in the Arizona State Park. Number 11. The Lost Treasure of the Inca Empire. In the deepest part of the unforgiving Langanetes mountain range between the Andes and the Amazon exists a fabulous Inca hoard, according to a legend that began in the 16th century. It was at the time the great Inca Empire in western South America was giving way to European invaders during the reign of Atahualpa after warring with his half-brother Huáscar for control of the empire. Soon, Atahualpa was captured at his palace in Cajamarca, in modern-day Peru, by Spanish commander Francisco Pizarro, who agreed to release the king on one condition: a room full of gold. The Inca agreed and started to deliver the ransom bit by bit to get their king out, but the Spaniards later reneged on the deal by killing Atahualpa before the last and largest part of the ransom was delivered. Instead of making the last delivery, the story goes, the gold was buried in a secret mountain cave. And there, the legend has remained, daring others to prove it. Further supporting the legend is the story of a Spaniard, known as Valverde, who was led to the gold after marrying from an Incan family 50 years after Atahualpa's death. However, the story says when Valverde died, he left written directions to its location, which is the so-called Derrotero de Valverde. But even with that, the gold trail went cold until the 1850s, when English botanist Richard Spruce traveled to Ecuador in search of the cinchona tree, the seeds of which were used to produce the anti-malarial drug, quinine. When Spruce returned to Britain, he reported that he had uncovered Valverde's guide and a related map made by a man named Atanasio Guzman. In the footsteps of Spruce, treasure seeker Barth Blake was reportedly the last person to find the gold. According to his writings, he only carried the size of gold that he could move at once and never returned. However, sources suggest that en route to New York, where he planned to raise funds for an expedition to recover his prize, he disappeared overboard. Since then, many who have attempted to retrace his steps into the treacherous Langanates have also paid with their lives, except Mark Honigsbaum, who wrote a book about his adventure and titled it Valverde's Gold. He teamed up with two adventurers, but eventually he didn't find the site, which seemingly had been lost as a result of the earthquakes that regularly rock the densely forested mountains. Number 10. The Treasure of the Concepción. This story takes us back to 1641, into the deep waters of the Dominican Republic. A galleon named Concepción smashed into a coral reef 80 miles northeast of the now Dominican Republic and sank with a huge store of silver and gold in her hold. However, in late 1985, a Pennsylvanian named Bert B. Weber Jr. found the ship. With the ship, Weber found pieces of 8 minted in 1638, 1639, and 1640, including porcelains from China shipped into Acapulco, trekked overland to Veracruz, and put aboard the Concepción for shipment to the Spanish crown. The Dominican authorities inspected these pieces of 8 and other precious items brought up by Weber and his search team and confirmed the discovery. After that, Weber, who only made little money for his family, returned to his duplex on North Chestnut Street for a quiet holiday. He planned to go back to the waters after announcing to New York that he had made a groundbreaking discovery to seek the treasure. If found, he would have to give to the government, and a percentage would go to him. But even with that, Weber and his family are obviously joyous, believing that their problems will be over once the treasure is found. Although Weber didn't disclose what the treasure could be worth, it has been speculated to be worth around $40 million. To date, the treasure has not been discovered, but maybe one day, Weber will become successful with his search. Number 9. The Treasure of Lima. The story of Lima's greatest treasure begins sometime in the 16th century when the Spanish conquerors finally managed to subdue the Inca. As mentioned earlier, the Spanish had their eyes on the Inca gold for a long time, so when they eventually subdued the Inca, they had the Inca gold to themselves. In the following decades and centuries, the Spaniards, especially the Catholic Church, amassed large quantities of gold in coinage, ingots, and other artifacts. Among these fabled treasures were elaborate large gold crosses with precious gems totaling about $60 million worth of gold, which would be worth over $1 billion in today's money. But when the South American Wars of Independence began arising in the early 19th century, panic quickly emerged among the high-ranking Spanish officials as Lima became the target for its treasure. On July 21st, though, the Americans managed to have partial control over Lima, but the treasure was nowhere to be found. Soon, it became clear that the Spanish officials had planned to transfer the treasure to the port of Callao and enlist a merchant vessel to help them smuggle the treasure out to the open sea. Once there, the ship would wait for the fate of Lima to be decided. If the revolutionaries were defeated, the treasure would be returned. The merchant vessel that they chose was named Mary Dear, a British conflict-neutral merchant from Bristol, with Captain William Thompson as its head. The plan was a gamble from the start, but the Spaniards were desperate and had to rely on Thompson and his crew. To be a little safe, the Spaniards placed several priests and armed soldiers onto the ship. Soon after, the vessel set out towards the open seas with the mission to cruise off the coast. But greed proved to be too much for Captain Thompson to handle so much, so he murdered the Spanish soldiers and priests while they were asleep and dumped their bodies into the water. He then changed course and sailed to Cocos Island, where he and his crew buried the treasure. Once they sailed off again, they were intercepted in the open sea by a Spanish naval frigate. A clash ensued and Mary Dear, being a merchant vessel, was quickly overwhelmed and the entire crew was captured. The whole crew was executed by hanging except 2 men, the captain, William Thompson, and his first mate, James Alexander Forbes, who were spared so they could lead the Spaniards to the spot where the treasure was buried. Soon after, they were back at Cocos Island, but the 2 captives, fearing death even if they cooperated, managed to flee from their captors and into the dense tropical jungle of Cocos Island. After searching, the Spaniards never found them and eventually had to sail away back to the mainland. Stranded on the island, Thompson and Forbes waited for months before they were rescued by a passing British whaler. However, the treasure they buried remained somewhere in the soil of this island, without taking anything from it in order not to raise suspicion. In the following months and years, Thompson and Forbes created detailed documents and maps relating to the location of the buried treasure so they wouldn't get lost looking for their treasure. Unfortunately, Thompson died shortly after, leaving James Forbes as the last remaining person to know the exact location of the buried and fabled treasure of Lima. Somehow, Forbes became extremely wealthy, but he passed the map and story from one generation to another. But because of the extreme wealth in his generation, his descendants didn't do anything about the map, thinking the story was not true. That way, no one looked for the treasure till there was no one alive who knew where the treasure was buried. Number 8. The Lost Treasure of the Knights Templar. Before we talk about the lost treasures, let's discuss the owners of the said treasure, the Knights Templar. They were members of the religious association of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. These were a religious military order of knighthood that was established following the success of the First Crusade, which conquered the Holy Land for Christendom between 1095 and 1099. In return for their work, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them some lands and a headquarters in Jerusalem itself, adjoining the former Temple of Solomon. Eventually, the role and responsibilities of the order began to expand as they gained influence throughout Europe. But suddenly, the knights vanished from the area. Rumors soon started to spread that the Knights Templar were at the Temple Mount because they intended to recover the lost treasures. Some also speculated that they had been wiped off for the same reason. It is not confirmed if and how they acquired the treasure, but what we do know is that they stayed in a space in the center of Jerusalem next to where the Temple of Solomon had been, and it is typically understood that they would have acquired these relics at that time. The significance of their cache of biblical artifacts is so great that some scholars have speculated that this treasure was the reason for their downfall. Number 7. The treasure of Captain Blackbeard. Blackbeard is that name that you must have heard severally in pirate stories because of his activities at the time. But while his activities are well known, little is known of his early years, except that his real name was Edward Teach. He was formerly a privateer during Queen Anne's War, the North American theater of the War of the Spanish Succession. To be clear, Privateers were private individuals or ships who were commissioned by governments to legally carry out acts of war. In a nutshell, they were pirates with papers. Soon after he got his job, he captured the enormous French slaving ship La Concorde off the coast of St. Vincent, loaded it with 40 cannons, and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. During the next 12 months, Blackbeard conducted several audacious acts of piracy and cemented his reputation as one of the most fearsome pirates of his time. But soon, things went bad for him after he ran his beloved Queen Anne's Revenge aground near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in June 1718. Somehow, he received a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden and seemingly turned his back on piracy. However, it was just for a while, as he was soon back to his old tricks. In the end, Blackbeard was beheaded and his reign of terror was over, but it only meant the beginning of the search for his hidden treasure. While you may not understand why someone like Blackbeard had so much fortune that is being sought even in this century, pillaging the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy was extremely profitable, and like other pirates operating during that time, Blackbeard would have amassed a great fortune. Although his time as a pirate lasted just over a year, Blackbeard was extremely good at what he did, leading many to believe his fortune in modern terms was well into the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions. However, after his death, nothing was found on any of his ships. So where did it all go? No one knows. And the most significant find in the hunt for Blackbeard's treasure was the discovery of Queen Anne's Revenge in 1996, with some artifacts on it. Since then, nothing has been heard of Blackbeard's treasure, and treasure hunters have not given up on it. Number 6. The San José Treasure. For more than 3 centuries, a Spanish galleon known as the Holy Grail of shipwrecks for its cache of spectacular treasure rested untraced at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. An early 18th century battle had sunk the ship after it came under attack from the largest of the British ships, the Expedition. It happened when the expedition was closing in and preparing to board, and an explosion suddenly ripped through the Spanish vessel. Within minutes, the San José had perished, taking all but 11 of its passengers and crew to a watery grave. The engagement was a disaster for the Spanish, and at the same, an underwhelming victory for Britain. The goal had been to not just deny the treasure to Spain, but to bring it home to England and Queen Anne. Instead, the only booty the British fleet seized was a nominal amount on board a third Spanish ship, the Santa Cruz. It is said that the treasure on the San José ship was worth almost $20 billion, which is the reason it has been the priority of the British back then, and an interest of several in the present day. While the shipwreck remained under the waters for years, it was however found in 2014 in the Colombian waters. The Colombia government announced it had found San José under roughly 2,000 feet of water, but the Spanish government tried to claim ownership since it belonged to them. While the treasure was not found, the authorities believed the shipwreck was a step closer to the treasure. In the end, there was an agreement to share whatever profit made from the discovery in equal halves. Number 5. The El Dorado Treasure. Fact or myth, El Dorado was a city said to be rich with gold. Although everything about this treasure is controversial, it can only mean there's something good about it. First was the location, which is disputed in different sources, but most commonly said to have been in South America. And if that was not tiring enough, the El Dorado is a combination of several tales, rather than one fixed story. In some accounts, El Dorado is a man covered in gold, in others, a lake or a valley of gold. Spanish conquistadors, upon hearing these tales of gold from the natives, believed there was a place abundant in gold and precious stones, and began referring to it as El Dorado, meaning the Golden One. Over time, the term evolved from referring to a man to a city, and then to a kingdom or an empire. By 1835, the myth of El Dorado was already 3 centuries old, but its origin and whether a real city of gold existed is still disputed. However, despite numerous expeditions, the actual existence of El Dorado remains a mystery. and even the name El Dorado is often used as a metaphor for an unattainable quest today. Number 4. The treasure of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada was a fleet of 130 ships that sailed from Corunna in late May 1588 under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia. The purpose was to escort an army from Flanders to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I and her establishment of Protestantism in England. However, English ships sailed from Plymouth to attack the Armada and were faster and more maneuverable than the larger Spanish galleons, enabling them to fire on the Armada without loss as it sailed east off the south coast of England. Following a bloody battle, the Armada, driven by southwest winds, withdrew north in a bid to return to Spain, but was disrupted further by storms. In the end, they had to retreat as the weather became extremely violent for their ship. By September 1588, the Armada was a broken collection of ships, and survivors began to appear in ones and twos off the coast of Northern Ireland. During the retreat, thousands of Spanish died and treasures became lost. However, some items were found in the wreckage, but large portions of the treasure are still missing today. Number 3. The Lost Treasure of Captain Kidd. On a cold and rainy day in May 1701 in London, England, soldiers and civilians were at the square waiting to witness the execution of a convict. Not just any convict, though. It was the notorious William Kidd. After the wood beneath his feet was kicked off, the rope broke, but that only preserved his life for a few minutes. However, the second attempt successfully became the end of his life and the beginning of his legend. While some remember him for his adventures, some do for his infamous buried treasure, which many believe may still be waiting to be discovered in New Jersey. Like Blackbeard, Kidd made a lot of fortune doing his job. He split some of the booty with his crew at the time, but soon went crazy and got himself denounced as a pirate and wanted by the British Crown. With his fortune, he purchased a small sloop named the San Antonio and headed for Boston with a small crew and hoped to take care of the problem. On the way to Boston, Kidd stopped at various locations in New Jersey to bribe authorities and hide some of his treasures. However, upon his arrival in Boston, Kidd was arrested by the new governor, who questioned him about his treasure. He claimed to have hidden a treasure worth 40,000 British pounds, but rumors at the time put his missing treasure at 400,000 pounds. However, only 10,000 pounds was ever recovered, and it was sent to England along with Kidd in the early 1700s. To this day, you can still see people occasionally searching for treasure at Cliffwood Beach, using shovels and metal detectors. Some tiny bits of gold and silver are still found on some occasions, but it has not been determined whether they are ancient or modern in age. Number 2. The Treasure of the Montezuma. When it comes to famous lost riches, the legend of Montezuma's treasure must be mentioned. For 500 years, the treasure, which is said to be worth billions in today's currency, has remained elusive. But before we start treasure hunting, let us venture back to the origins of this tale and uncover the bloody history of the fabled lost treasure. It was in 1519 when the Spanish conquistador landed on the shores of what is now Mexico. The annals of history tell us this was a pivotal moment in the history of the Americans, as it marked the beginning of the end for one of the continent's greatest empires, the Aztecs, ruled by their 9th emperor, Montezuma II. Montezuma had grown the Aztec Empire in size, power, and wealth during his reign, transforming the land into a cultural wonder, adding a zoo, botanic gardens, and even a library to its already impressive display of pyramids, temples, and plazas. So, when the Spanish arrived at the gates of the Aztecs, they were well received with a welcome party. But while the party went on, the Spanish locked the Aztecs in and massacred them in their hundreds. The Spanish claimed to be saving innocent people from a human sacrifice, whereas the Aztecs argued it was out of sheer greed after the Spanish saw the gold on display during the festival. The Spanish took all that they could and headed for one of the causeways before they were ambushed and nearly wiped out. This is where the legend of Montezuma's lost treasure takes hold. The fleeing Spanish soldiers were said to have dumped it in the water surrounding the causeway to lighten their load as they ran for their lives. But till today, that location has remained the cause of debate even between historians. Number 1. Treasure of the Lost City of Z. The Lost City of Z isn't actually the Lost City of Z, but the name British surveyor Percy Fawcett gave to a secret city that was said to have streets paved in silver and roofs made of gold. Fawcett became obsessed with the idea of lost civilization when he was invited by a British organization to survey part of a frontier between Brazil and Bolivia. He then formulated theories of a city he called Zed in 1912, after having other ideas about the City of Gold through studying. Soon, Fawcett set out to find the city in 1921 with his crew, but hardships of the jungle, dangerous animals, and rampant diseases made him pull out. The same year, he went in search of the city again, this time alone, and again he returned with nothing. However, in April 1925, he tried again, but the only thing that returned home was a letter Fawcett wrote to his wife. Fawcett was nowhere to be found, leading many to speculate that he must have run away with the treasure to enjoy all by himself, given that he promised to be back home soon, but never showed up. Although Fawcett and the city of Z were never found, the interests of researchers on the case have led to discoveries of numerous ancient cities and remains of religious sites. As for the truth about the city of Z, we just may never know. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.